Good morning. My name is Bob Frazee. I live in Barnstable Village. I've been a Barnstable resident since the early 1970s, and pretty much all of that time I've been interested in and very involved in the subject of historic preservation, Barnstable's wonderful collection of historic buildings and sites. And I think it's part of the magic of the town and what makes each village distinct and individual and important. I appreciate being asked to speak to the committee. This is a format I'm not terribly familiar with. Forgive me if I seem a little apprehensive about it, but I think it will work. I was asked to take a look at what some accomplishments have occurred since the last local comprehensive planning process in 2010 that pertain to heritage and cultural resources, and then to think about things going on right now that are of concern or that have been successful, and look forward to times in the future of a decade or two more. I'm not sure if my presentation will do entirely that, and I invite any of you to reach out to me and ask questions or invite me in to chat for a few minutes if you'd like to follow up, and that would be fine with me. Since the Local Comprehensive Plan of 2010 and the Historic Preservation Plan of 2010, the same year, were published, several of the recommendations have been completed, and I think they're really important. One of them is the historic inventory of the town was continued, which involved a windshield survey of an analysis of over 1,500 previously unsurveyed properties in several villages, particularly concentrated on the outlying villages rather than Hyannis, which was treated as a separate matter and had already been addressed to some extent. And as a result of that effort, 80 new Form B inventory forms were completed to assist the Barnstable Historical Commission in the event that any of the properties were brought forward for public hearing as a result of an attempt or wish by their owner to demolish them in part or complete demolition. And I can't stress enough how important having that information available is for the commission to make good decisions and to have good conversations with the applicants, which I think is tremendously important. I've just begun serving on the Historical Commission again in the last year. This is my second time. I did so in the early 80s, in the mid 80s to early 90s. And it's a day and night difference in a digital age with growth and development that has occurred over the last 40 years, pressing on historic buildings in appropriate ways in most cases. But it's an eye-opening experience, and all of the tools that can be made available are extremely helpful to make good decisions. It's always been my feeling that every historic building, every building of 75 years of age or older, deserves its due process, its day, its consideration. It may not need to be saved, it may not need to be looked at with a great critical eye, but it should at least be considered. And I believe that is the underlying premise of the ordinance for historic preservation in the town of Barnstable, and I appreciate that. To that extent, one of the other recommendations of the original plan in 2010 was to alter the demolition delay ordinance, which we have, which causes applicants to come before us, sent to the Historical Commission by the building inspector, which we appreciate, and the relationship there is both a very important one and a very good one. And they are heard in a public hearing to determine whether the demolition they're about to undertake will damage the cultural heritage of the town of Barnstable in a manner that cannot be addressed in any other way. The demolition delay was moved from 6 to 18 months. 6 months was proven to be inadequate and ineffective, which I can assure you really is a sincere change. For the most part, 6 months was just enough time for everybody to get their ducks in a row and go ahead and demolish things anyway. 18 months means everybody has to stop and think about it. And more often than not, I'm finding that we find alternatives to demolition, whether they be moving a building or saving parts of it. And in the very bare bones thing of a demolition process, the last resort, we try to save or urge people to save historic building materials from the structures, which are apt to be first growth wood and lumber, which is not replaceable and is of a much higher quality than anything that's available today. And lastly, as a result of the planning process in 2010, one of the accomplishments that I think is tremendously important for downtown Hyannis and that bears on historic and maritime interests is the Downtown Unified Design Regulations and Guidelines that were finished up in 2023. That review process now looks at historic and maritime interests in a way that I feel is suitably protective and will help ongoing. There we go. One of my recommendations for the town is a planning matter, and one of the recommendations that came from the planning process 10 years ago, well, 15 years ago, is that the town consider pursuing a certified local government status for the Barnstable Historical Commission. There are advantages and a few challenges associated with doing this. The primary advantage, however, is that it would give Barnstable Planning and Development Department and the Barnstable Historical Commission priority access to MHC, Mass Historical Commission, and federal historic preservation funds that are issued to the state by the federal government annually. And being first in line for such things, although it is still a competitive process, you have to go through an application process to compete, is a tremendous advantage. And these funds are typically devoted to developing programs that support historic preservation in the town, whether it's continuing surveys and inventories or whether it is something more along the lines of technical assistance, training for commission members, or other kinds of endeavors that will help the members of the public who own these buildings understand them better and be more inclined to preserve them. Challenges to obtaining a CLG status are that there will be more stringent requirements for qualifying candidates to serve on the Barnstable Historical Commission. People will need to have a resume that reflects a certain amount of expertise or experience or a long proven interest in the subject matter that indicates a strong familiarity with it, whereas that's not necessarily the case now. And we've had wonderful commissioners over the years who've come to the commission simply out of an interest in the subject matter and who've, I won't say they've risen to the occasion, but they've become amazing commissioners and very interested and very good at what they do. So it's not a critique of anyone, but it's something that's required by the state of Massachusetts. It will increase the workload for inventory work and National Register nomination work because it is an expectation of the state and the federal government that these kinds of activities be increased somewhat as a result of being certified local government. And last but not least for that, it may be possible that we would need to have additional staff time available to help guide that kind of process. These are just things to consider if this is pursued. I want to propose that the town consider nominating 2 properties that it already owns for listing on the National Register. I'm personally very familiar with both of them. I will admit a certain bias, but because of my familiarity with them, I feel very certain that they are worthy of the nomination. One of them is Burgess House on Route 149 in Marston's Mills, which has an ongoing restoration that began in 1996. And the town has been amazing at bringing Community Preservation Act funds to bear on it, as well as other creative funding and talent sources to produce a building that is now very usable in lots of ways and of which Marston's Mills is extremely proud. And the other is Cape Cod Airfield at 1000 Race Lane in Marston's Mills, which opened in 1929 and will have its 95th birthday celebration sometime later this year. Cape Cod Airfield was purchased by the town from the Danforth property as an open space acquisition in 2003. And although it was not an easy process, determined with much support from all the neighborhoods around it to operate the airfield as an original historic grass airfield. And it is now virtually unique in that category in this region. The only other airfield I'm familiar with like it is on Martha's Vineyard at Katama. See, I'm not advancing my slides as I should. You can tell I don't do this very often, but that's perfectly okay. I'll leave this one up for a couple of minutes. The Burgess House and Cape Cod Airfield are very much worth visiting. There will be an open house at Burgess House during the Hydrangea Festival, sponsored by the Marston's Mills Historical Society and the Village Association in July. And Cape Cod Airfield is open, well, every day for people who want to come and just look from the sidelines. And they do have all kinds of opportunities that are recreational that you can hire for plane rides and skydiving and all kinds of things. I don't mean this is an advertisement for the operation running it, but it is just a beautiful, beautiful place. And another opportunity is just to park on Route 149 around sunset and watch the planes take off. It's just incredible. On a more sobering note, I want to say that protecting historic buildings and neighborhoods in Barnstable, or anywhere for that matter, can be an extremely challenging process. And I think there's nowhere that became more obvious than through the loss of the buildings on Sea Captain's Row, Pleasant Street, just a few years ago. This process strained the relationships between several boards and commissions and the town council at the time, which I think everyone regrets. I'm not going to play Monday morning quarterback about it. It isn't about trying to think we should have done something different, but it is to say, what can we learn from that process? And in a more positive way, looking forward, how could we have prevented those National Register buildings from being as vulnerable as they were, from degrading or deteriorating to the extent they had, that they became more attractive for demolition and a complete new build there and development for housing, which I totally know is of critical importance all over the Cape, not just here in Barnstable. But I think there were better ways to have done that had we been proactive for a longer time prior to those years. And so it's a challenge for Barnstable to try and think its way through that as best it can. I would suggest, if I may, that the Historical Commission and other town departments continue working really closely with the building department. I believe this already occurs, but if there were a known stated purpose to keep an eye on historic buildings that might be falling into disuse or disrepair, reaching to them in some fashion prior to their becoming critically injured by this absence of affirmative maintenance would be tremendously important. And so all parties who are brought to these buildings for any purpose, including members of the public historical societies, people who live near them, if they see that they are in trouble, please notify the building department or the Historical Commission, but particularly the building department, and see if an inspection of some kind would help bring a remedy to bear. And with that in mind, presently there aren't really very many funding sources available for the private homeowner. We have opportunities through the Community Preservation Act to supply funding to a limited extent, but for matching grant funds for nonprofit and publicly owned properties that qualify and that demonstrate a clear public benefit, since these are public funds. And what I propose is consider looking at a historic building protection fund, whether it be local to Barnstable or regional to the county, whether it be a publicly run fund or whether it be a private nonprofit. I have no particular dog in that hunt. I just think it's an important idea. And I offer a couple of suggested avenues. One is that we take a look at the Providence Revolving Fund, which is run by the Providence Preservation Society in Providence, Rhode Island. It's been around for over 40 years. It has a tremendous success record and learned long ago how to combine different elements of advantage to produce a result, to save and reuse historic buildings and save neighborhoods in the process. It's a more urban setting, but many of their techniques would still apply. I've provided the link to their website, and you'll notice that they provide now a number of technical services that are of great benefit to the individual property owners, whether they're commercial or private. And I think that's something that we could follow the example of here in Barnstable. Also, at a recent meeting of the Hyannis Historical Society held at the JFK Hyannis Museum, representatives from Protect Our Past, which is a relatively new organization based in Chatham, Mass., led by Ellen Briggs, made a presentation. We afterwards had a very interesting give and take about different techniques for helping people who own historic properties and helping towns who try to manage and save and protect historic properties do a better job. And with that in mind, I suggest you take a look also at that organization and reach out to them for assistance and leadership. They offer educational films, which are very professionally produced. They have a service which offers historic home evaluation, which is something that many historic homeowners could benefit from if they understood their buildings better. They might be less interested in removing them. They have a restoration resource catalog in the works, which provides access to the sufficient technologies and talent to operate a maintenance operation on historic buildings. And they also are helping to organize a historic buildings material salvage site so that if a building is torn down as a last resort, at the very least, the materials may be salvaged and cut for reuse. And I mentioned earlier in this report that the historic building materials from 2 centuries ago are from trees that were first growth. They are of a much higher quality. Even though they're 200 years old and have been standing in a building all that time, they are still better material than you can buy today in the open market. And last but not least, POP is working on and hopes to deliver by September or October this year a pattern book for Cape Cod, which will be a little bit of a friendly pickup version of something like the design guidelines for Cape Cod that the Cape Cod Commission produced several years ago. And I think it will be very approachable and very good for homeowners. In our history in the last few years, we have lost some buildings, and that just goes with the territory. Buildings age, they age out, their ownership moves on, and they are either abandoned or they are just not kept up. And we understand that happens, that there are ways to address that, but sometimes there are problems. And in this case, I want to show you 2 properties here just briefly that were lost in Marston's Mills in the last 5 or 6 years, which resulted as a result of the development of an open space plan where they were in conflict with the entity seeking to create or acquire open space for land preservation. I personally don't think that land preservation and building or historic resource preservation ought to be at odds with each other. I don't think there's a need for that, but it may take encouragement and guidance by the town to see that it doesn't occur when it's possible to prevent it. One of the houses we lost was the Charles Marston House, 1821, which is demolished prior to land acquisition along Mill Pond. And the other was the Fuller Farmhouse, which was really an icon of Marston's Mills along Route 149. It was built circa 1887. It was a farmstead that was built by the community for the Fuller family as a result of their loss to their original farmhouses and a fire. And it's just an amazing story. In any case, it's sad that we lost these. I think it might have been preventable. And what I want to encourage is that when open space applicants are seeking funding for acquiring open space, ask them to please inventory all of the cultural and heritage resources on the land they seek to acquire, and then certify that proper care will be taken to preserve those resources. It doesn't have to be a big challenge. I think it's simply something that is an easy way to help prevent these outcomes. Looking forward, as I was asked to do for this presentation, what are my hopes or thoughts about 10 or 20 years from now in Barnstable? That's a big thought, and that's hard to come up with an answer for. But I would say one of my leading concerns is that we need to engage younger generations of Barnstable residents immediately. And without their engagement and their enthusiasm, we're sunk. We really, as people in my generation move on through and past retirement and draw back from their activity on boards and commissions and committees and being involved in municipal activities, someone needs to step in. And we would love for it to be people, wouldn't we, who grew up here and live here. And that's hard. I also think that we need to reach out to the entire community. And have a better representation on all of our volunteer boards and commissions from the Mashpee Wampanoag tribe members, African Americans, Cape Verdeans, and other people of color. It's not a hard connection to make, and yet I don't see or believe that we have as broad a constituency to support our decisions and efforts as we could and should have. In order to obtain the time and service and interest of a younger generation, I will say I reached out to my own daughter on this, who's in her early 40s, and who grew up in Barnstable. And she works with underserved and underperforming public schools in the Northeast, helping them to achieve better results for their student populations. And so she's working from her home and online and in person all the time, and her suggestions follow, and it's simple. Let's make it easy for single working parents to become actively involved. We don't presently do that, in my opinion. Fund and equip and staff all of the town AV venues so that all meetings can be hybrid capable. I know that that is possible in the main meeting room, main town council hearing room here. I don't believe it is possible in other areas, or not in sufficient areas, to permit all of the town's boards and committees to meet in a hybrid format. But I think that's really important. It's not just because of the pandemic, although that taught us some things. I think more than that, it's because we need to be able to be as flexible as we are asking our applicants to be, if they would even wish to apply. Many people are put off by the difficulty of assigning themselves time to be in a certain place at a certain time, which comes in conflict with their family and work needs. And I would also say that in providing a hybrid opportunity for both in-person and virtual participation in meetings, doing so in a way that allows for both synchronous and asynchronous collaborative work environments, allows people to contribute to resulting decision-making processes without having to attend the same meeting at the same time all the time. I'm going to guess, and I didn't put it on my slide, that there are some Massachusetts open meeting law complications for this, but I don't believe Barnstable needs to stumble over something like that, and I think we wouldn't be the first community to be looking hard at doing these things. I don't think there are other ways to reach the younger community and bring them into the decision-making process unless we're willing to take a step forward and do something of this nature. In the sense of further broadening representation and engagement, I think we need to start with the youngest audience we can, and Barnstable has a long tradition of encouraging, and through the Cobb Trust Fund, sponsoring grade 5 children going to historic sites, going to the Cammett House, the historic Cammett House in Osterville, or the Barnstable Historical Society on Route 6A in Barnstable Village. And these are wonderful experiences for the kids, but they're experiences they have at a very young age. And I've been reading up a fair bit on this, and it's been well documented that as kids move into their teenage years and move into high school, experiences that they had at grade 5 level are not as immediate on their minds and don't seem as tangible, real, or as credible amongst their peers to be enthusiastic about as things that they encounter and experience then during those teen years themselves. And so I suggest funding a cool historic preservation learning opportunity for teens, not just for 5th graders. Maybe the Cobb Trust can be approached for that. I don't honestly know what the parameters are there. Start or collaborate with HP-friendly programs that offer a hands-on component and provide a tangible recognition, a form of recognition or tangible results. An example would be the boat building program, youth boat building program at Cape Cod Maritime Museum. Watching the lights go on when those kids suddenly realize how cool it is to use a little math and build a boat and use their head, heart, and hands together is an incredible experience. It's one of the things that motivates the instructors there. It's something we could all learn from. The Scout program, Boy Scouts of America and Girl Scouts of America, have a patch program in some states for historic preservation, and the National the National Park Service also offers a patch for historic preservation for youth endeavors. So I'd suggest looking at some of our local museums, the Maritime Museum that I mentioned, Coast Guard Heritage Museum, the blacksmith shop right next to the Coast Guard Heritage Museum. I watched a school bus pull in there a few weeks ago on a very rainy day, and a number of kids hopped out, and I realized they weren't there to visit the museum, they were there to visit the blacksmith. I think that's a perfect example of something that will animate kids of the teenage years, and it will begin to introduce them to the notion of things that are old are still interesting, things that are old still have meaning in their lives and can inform things they will do and make decisions about in their future. I think it's critically important to find out what matters and is important to this age demographic. It's not always easy to do, but I think we should focus on endeavoring to do that. And we should plan on or expect to hear answers we may be surprised by, and that do not always focus on their classroom experience, but focus more on their personal experience. And that's what the foregoing comment was really aimed for. Our standard concepts about National Register criteria, the basis on which we judge the significance of buildings and many other things, needs really to be broadened for preservation and management of heritage and cultural resources. This is something that will be town-wide. It's not just unique to a historical commission. I think we need to keep the old playbook, but we need to expand on it. We need to work with and value what is valued by our youngest generation, and we need to demonstrate that we're doing that in order to have and deserve their trust and credibility. I would especially suggest encouraging active public use of historic commercial buildings in a way that attracts and encourages the younger generations to enjoy and use them. I mean, some obvious ways of doing that are emphasize art, food, and entertainment opportunities. We have some challenges coming up, and there is no surprise in that. 2 properties will be considered or are already being considered for redevelopment aimed at creating badly needed housing in downtown Hyannis. And in each of the 2 I've chosen to select here, there are historic structures on the properties. And it's my personal opinion that I hope that the town will guide the developers to respect and use the historic buildings in a positive way rather than simply demolishing them or obliterating them. Design and build so well that in the 75 years from now, our new buildings will be defended by tomorrow's preservationists. That's a standard that I was taught in school at Roger Williams University many times over the years, and it was our historic preservation department was run by the School of Architecture, and they were really just emphasizing high quality use of materials, high quality design, careful judgment that is not just about the architect but is about the community, and that reflects an incorporation of massing and shapes and styles, architectural detail, colors and materials from the existing historic built environment that can be instructive in designing new construction. The Hyannis Trust Company Bank Building, formerly known as TD Bank, is one of the structures here in the picture on the left. It was built in 1924. I looked at the inventory form for it and was not too impressed that someone decided that it had a meaningless or unidentifiable style. I disagree with that. I think in brick and concrete, it is a evolved approximation of the Beaux-Arts type of development that we would ascribe to a slightly earlier time on grander municipal buildings. But the 2-story arches and the pediment are something that I think could be emulated and certainly could be saved in this existing building and emulated in anything adding on to it. At the Cascade Motor Lodge, which we all know is a seriously blighted property and richly deserving of redevelopment, there is an 1870 house, the Hallett Baxter House, and there's a surprising amount of original detail still available in the building. It was not obliterated when windows were boarded up or siding was changed. I hope that the developer, at the urgings of the town, will strive to use that building on the property in some manner that keeps it part of the historic streetscape in this part of Barnstable's downtown Hyannis Main Street. Lastly, just looking ahead, there are always buildings that worry people who care about historic structures. One most of the people in this building drive by every day on their way to work is the Rodney Baxter House, which is also known locally as the Octagon House. It's at 289 South Street. It's privately owned. It is, I believe, still occupied. It is a little bit of a mystery to those who are interested in it. It is a building that's been deteriorating gradually for many years. And I don't believe I've ever spoken to anyone interested in historic buildings in the town of Barnstable who both isn't aware of it and isn't concerned and doesn't hope some preservation opportunity will present itself. The house is unique in Barnstable. It's rare in the nation, and it is a landmark building, although it is somewhat obscured now by vegetation and foliage. And I would just use it as an example of a way for both Barnstable Historical Commission and the town's preservation services overall to keep looking ahead to try and prevent loss of important historic structures. The inventories that we have done, that have been done by the planning department or through the planning department over the last few years, have been extremely instructive in helping us identify buildings that are of significance, that were built in mid-20th century and on. I would remind everybody listening to this that every year that goes by, a new bunch of buildings become eligible for consideration by the Historical Commission should they appear before us for a demolition. And not all of them will be saved. Not all of them need or should be saved. All of them deserve at least a minimal review as to their relative historic significance. There are surprises in those analysis, and don't presume that just because a building was built mid-century, last century, it's of no consequence. That is not the case. There are wonderful exceptions, and if you visit any of the town's historical society websites, you'll see some examples of those, in particular Hyannis's, featuring the Lustron House, which is here in Hyannis, and if you look at that and read about it just for a moment, you'll be kind of impressed. It's a mid-century modern house that's in amazingly good condition because of the way it was built, and it's a perfect example of a house that was, although manufactured and basically a kit house, it was done in such a way that it's still here and it's still in good shape, and if somebody wanted to tear it down, I know I would fight for it, and I hope you would too. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.